Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Like that deep sigh, it has been a busy week. I'm sure it's been a week for all of you as well. I'm happy to welcome Facundo Robles onto the podcast. He is the program coordinator at the Wilson Center's Latin America program, at the Wilson Center's Argentina project, also wears a number of other hats, professor at National Defense University in Argentina. He goes through all his credentials at the end of the episode. We've been trying to get together for weeks, months now, and our schedules just kept misaligning, but we were finally able to get him on. There's two things I want to say before we get to the meat of the episode. The first is that I worry that the Israel-Iran war is crowding out the fact that developments are happening everywhere around the world. It's already hard to get information, but when you think about how everything now is focused on the very, very important things happening in the Middle East, the rest of the world still spins. So part of me thought, we shouldn't do this podcast primarily on Latin America. We should be focusing on nothing but Israel-Iran. But then I took a step back and said, actually, no. Like, it's really important to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the rest of the world, even as this craziness is happening in the Middle East. And then even so, Facundo did an amazing job taking what's happening in the Middle East and saying, no, it really does matter to Latin America and to South America in general. And the decisions that President Trump makes will affect everything from elections in South America to how South American countries are going to align. Maybe it affects the calculations of Nicolas Maduro and the regime in Venezuela. I would be absolutely terrified if I was them, looking at the precedent that Israel has set in bombing Iran. I mean, lots of terrifying things there. So we were initially going to try and just talk about Latin America and then maybe push this episode out in a week or two when things calm down. But we're not going to do that. We're going to push it out as quick as possible. I've been very busy this week. If you have not signed up for my Substack, I'm putting out analysis very, very often on Substack. I'm using the Substack really as the place where my first drafts are going. So as I'm trying to get things out of my fingertips before they go to my clients, I'm getting very rough drafts there. It's free. You can find it online if you just search Jacob Shapiro in Substack. So it's there if you want those types of written thoughts. We're pumping out content on this podcast, and then also Cousin Marco and I on the Geopolitical Cousins podcast feed, pumping out content, actually recording with him a couple hours after I hit stop on this recording. So, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. And we'll keep trying to get as much content as we can out to you. Obviously, I also have clients and a family and everything else, but I find that moments like these are the moments where providing sober, well-sourced access to a minimum amount of information that we have is super important, because for whatever reason, the way our media ecosystem works, like it's not delivering that. It's a lot of hard work to sort through all of this and get some sense of truth on what's happening now, and then a sense of what this could all mean and where we're going from here. You can email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you want to talk about any of the things that you've heard on this podcast, anything going on in the world. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. It's crazy out there. Cheers, and see you there. Facundo, first of all, it's nice to meet you. We've been trying to put this together for a while. Schedules are difficult. I also have to tell you, I had not seen you face to face before. It's incredibly disorienting for me. You look exactly like my college roommate. I feel like I'm talking to Elias, who is probably listening to this podcast right now. Like the glasses, the beard, the hair, like the matcha. It's like literally I'm talking to my college roommate. So it's nice to see you, man.
No, it's nice to see you, Jacob. Thanks for having me. And also, well, on my end, first of all, I really appreciate doing this on a holiday. It's Juneteenth in the U.S., so I know many people are off today, and I'm grateful for your time.
Right back at you. So, well, let's dive in. I know that you prepped some thoughts about the effect of the Israel-Iran war on what is happening in the Middle East. We're recording, as he said, on Juneteenth. It's 8:48 a.m. Central here. Even if we get this up like 12 hours later, who knows? Like many things could have changed at this point. So, if you're listening and anything seems overtaken by events, hey, this was a nice snapshot from this particular moment. Before I ask you about to develop those thoughts about the impact of the war on Latin America, I actually the first question I wanted to start with you was that, to me, Latin America and specifically South America seems divorced from the chaos of Eurasia. I mean, Eurasia, you've got the Russia-Ukraine war going. We've got India and Pakistan at each other's throats. Now we've got Israel and Iran striking each other. North Korea is still sitting up there doing their crazy thing. Like, you start looking around Eurasia, like there's basically conflict everywhere. And that's not to say there isn't conflict in Latin America. There's obviously narco-terrorism and the conflicts between sort of cartels and governments and all sorts of political populist issues and issues of democratic transition from Peru to Argentina to Mexico, everywhere else. But it's qualitatively different. We're not talking about state on state war in Latin America. We're not talking about nuclear proliferation. We're not talking about, potentially hundreds of thousands of dead and like all these sorts of things being realigned. So I guess just from somebody who is sitting in Buenos Aires, who is sitting in the region, do you look out at the region and suddenly it's like, yeah, like we're pretty good. Like maybe we have our problems, but this is the place to be. This is the future because we have cheap energy resources and we have cheap food resources and we are far away from all these crazy people who seem obsessed with bombing each other into the previous century. So I just take that any direction you want. You can take that right into your thoughts as well. But I'm struck by the stability of Latin America and South America compared to the rest of the world, which that comment in and of itself is kind of remarkable.
Oh, Jacob, I think that's one of the most interesting points regarding the region. And in fact, when talking about Latin American international relations, that's one of the things that first comes up. Latin America, even though it's very difficult to talk about it as one block because it's a very like heterogeneous region, each country has its own particular dynamic. And it's very difficult to talk about Latin America going in one direction. You can see trends, but not one direction. Having said that, Latin America is characterized by being a peaceful region, as you said. There's no like state-to-state wars. You have internal, you have domestic issues, really important issues, and also you have in the continent you have the United States being like the hegemon of the region. Historically, over the last centuries, controlling the region and being the main character there. Of course, you had some other countries trying to question that, trying to be the main characters of it. You see China challenging this position mainly on trade and investments, but it's been always the United States. You can see the Monroe Doctrine. There's been an influence, a direct influence of the United States. We don't have that many variety of voices coming from out the region.
Mm-hmm.
You have some, let's say, marginal voices, some actors that are coming, some countries that have agreements, formal or informal agreements with different countries like Russia, Iran, China, Europe as the European Union. But it's very difficult to see that you have more a different country rather than US having influence. Having said that, you also have the region has been historically challenged by its own military coups. Each country has, in the 20th century, been marked by extremely violent military coups, and that has also questioned the role of the defense sector in the region. Having countries that they don't even have any sort of armed forces, like Costa Rica, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that the role of the military is also extremely weak in Latin America. And you can see that there is different ways in which we create problems. Regarding the nuclear proliferation, it's very interesting to see the Tlatelolco agreement, in which countries of Latin America have agreed not to get involved in that. And that's in fact one of the most clear examples of how the region can work on one same direction. However, I must say is the exception, not the rule.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Well, let's dive into some of the thoughts that I know that you prepared. So, how do you think that the war is going to affect different countries in the region, and take it wherever you want to start?
Well, being very upfront, I'm not here to offer expert analysis on the developments unfolding minute by minute in the Middle East. As you mentioned, it's really important to clarify the date and time of this, as a lot of things are changing. There are people far more qualified than me for doing that. In fact, as a recommendation, if you're looking for a great breakdown of what's happening in the region, I really recommend. There was one of the Carnegie Connects. It's a podcast from the Carnegie Endowment yesterday between Sima Shine and Ali Baez, moderated by the great Aaron David Miller, which is incredibly helpful. Um, but shifting gears a bit, and this is where I hope I can add some value. Think, what does all of this mean for Latin America? Um, if we start thinking of this country by country, we will see different consequences. But as the region, we have some markets in common. So since the escalation began, the Brent crude has gone up more than 8%, right? Reflecting the mounting risk premium attached to the Middle East volatility. According to analysts from institutions such as Goldman Sachs, Barclays, Energy Intelligence, the current price movement could just be the beginning. And in fact, some experts suggest that depending on how the conflict evolves, particularly if the United States becomes directly involved or if there's a disruption in oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, the price of oil could rise significantly further. That kind of spike doesn't just affect oil producers and consumers, it sent ripple effects, of course, through other markets too, including agriculture, where Latin America plays a significant role. For example, if you take soybean oil, the July 2025 contract in Chicago went up 1% in a week, and the March 2026 up almost 2%. These affects countries like Argentina, Brazil, who are big exporters, but also Peru and Chile, who import a lot of their food imports. And also you have the fertilizer. Iran is a major player in nitrogen-based fertilizers, and Israel exports a lot of potassium chloride. And so disruptions in supply from either country hit farmers across Latin America almost immediately. If we break it down country by country, giving like a brief, a very like domestic diagnosis, and then going to the most geopolitical side of this. In Mexico, you have President Sheinbaum beginning her administration in October 2024. Her presidency marked a continuation of AMLO's populist agenda, but with more pragmatic and technocratic tone. In early 2025, the Mexican Congress approved sweeping judicial reforms that replaced all sitting members of the judiciary through direct elections. This move broke not only with Mexicans, but also with Westerners' traditional model of checks and balances, and has drawn widespread criticism for undermining judicial independence. Geopolitically, Mexico remains at the center of the North American vulnerability. Its proximity to the United States and deep integration into continental supply chains means that any significant escalation in the Middle East, such as disruptions in energy or global shipping, directly affects Mexico's energy security, investment flows, macroeconomic stability. Energy prices and logistics volatility would be felt first, of course. As I mentioned, most strongly in Mexico, particularly in the automotive and agricultural sectors, where you have the just-in-time supply models that are already strained. Moreover, you have Mexico being part of the USMCA, and this agreement has been, Mexico has seen the agreement's mechanism tested repeatedly, particularly on labor enforcement, energy policy, environmental rules. The USMCA is officially scheduled for review in 2026, but negotiations have been pushed forward, and early discussions are set to begin in late 2025, following pressure from the United States, particularly from President Trump, who views the agreement as too, let's call it, tolerant, and has signaled interest in tightening rules on autos, steel, and transshipment from China. Mexico is trying to prepare for this review through a government-led dialogue with business leaders and U.S. stakeholders. However, having the confluence of the judicial reforms, investor uncertainty, tariff threats, all of this has already taken a toll. The Mexico Central Bank has stated that the foreign direct investment, the FDI, dropped 21% in the first quarter of 2025, and the economy is expected to grow by just 0.1% this year. In all this context, and knowing what is happening in the Middle East, Pemex may see some relief from the higher global oil prices, but the broader Mexican economy remains vulnerable to inflationary pressure, peso volatility, um, shift in political winds in Washington. Of course, if the conflict in Middle East expands, Mexico would find itself economically exposed and politically constrained. At the very moment, it is being asked to renegotiate the future of its most important trade relationship. So it's really important to take a take a look, a very close look at what's happening in Mexico and what will happen in Mexico for the next couple of months. Um, if you want, we can keep working on country by country, if as you wish.
Yeah, no, because I mean it's and there's part of me that wants to understand the impact of the war on Latin America, and also part of me that thinks that the war itself is crowding out important developments and will continue to crowd out important developments in the weeks and months ahead. Because, as you said, with Mexico, Mexico is undergoing fundamental transitions here, and I'm not sure what the future of Mexican democracy looks like. Claudia Sheinbaum seems relatively pragmatic to me, but once she goes, what's going to replace her? Like Morena looks like it's becoming the PRI, and we're not always going to have a pragmatic person at the top who is willing to limit herself in some way. Peru looks like an absolute dumpster fire. If we're talking about democracy, well, we look like we're transitioning between authoritarianism and chaos. It seems like Peruvian democracy is dying a slow death. You've got the example of El Salvador sitting there, which makes anyone with a moral center uncomfortable. But you also can't deny that El Salvador is orders of magnitude more peaceful, more stable, more economically prosperous than when Bukele started. So it's hard to argue with results. And then you've got Argentina. You're down there in Buenos Aires. We've got the chainsaw wielding maniac. We've got Lula in Brazil, where he's sort of cannibalized the left. To a sense, it seems to me that the left has become Lula, and that eventually Lula will exit stage left, and then it's just the center right in Brazil going forward. Brazil also a country where the military plays a bigger role. So I know I rambled a little bit there, but I mean, those are at least some of the countries that are at the top of my mind. So I'm curious if that's your list as well, or if there are others that we should be thinking about, or maybe which country on that list do you think is most instructive for us to talk about?
Let's go. You said a lot of things, extremely interesting and serious things. On top of that, we also have a lot of elections happening this year and the next that will change also this trend in the region. As you being extremely simplistic in saying the left and the right, you
Mm-hmm.
can see some of the governments of the left of the continent uh, potentially moving to the right in the next elections. And we are talking about Chile, Brazil, Colombia mainly. Um, Going into each of these, I will start with Argentina first, which I think is a very serious country, knowing what is happening in Middle East, but also what had happened in that country before. President Javier Milei was in Israel at the time that the attacks to the nuclear facilities in Iran started. In fact, it was there that he announced the relocation of Argentina's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Uh, it was just hours before Israel's strike. And that was a big shift in Argentina's foreign policy. It brought the country much closer to Israel and the US, uh, although rhetorically Milei had already stated that. And it really brought with its long-standing tradition of neutrality in the region. And it's important because the implications are twofold. On the one hand, this strengthens ties with powerful allies, but on the other, it may increase Argentina's exposure to international terrorism, especially given its tragic history. On March 17, 1982, the Israeli embassy was bombed in Buenos Aires, killing 22 people. On July 18, 1994, the AMIA, which is the Argentine Israelite Mutual Association, was bombed in Buenos Aires as well, killing 85 people. And in fact, the latter was one of the deadliest anti-Semitic attacks since the World War II.
Yep.
Both were linked to Hezbollah and Iran. Iran has a history of using proxy wars to strike targets abroad. So Argentina is once again on alert. The relocation of the embassy, combined with Milei's high-profile embrace of Israeli leadership, could play the country in the crosshairs. And while national intelligence and counter-terror capabilities have improved significantly since the 90s, attacks by non-state actors often require minimal infrastructure, making them really hard to prevent. In the energy sector, Argentina stands to benefit, let's say, from a high global oil and LNG prices due to its vast Vaca Muerta reserves. And also, Argentina is planning to expand the LNG export infrastructure. However, it still relies heavily on imported refined fuels, and price volatility could disrupt domestic consumptions and logistics. And this is really important regarding Milei's point of view, because when he took office in December 2023, monthly inflation was 25%. Monthly inflation was 25%. Last week, the May 2025 figure came at 1.5%, a dramatic turnaround. Of course, for a regular or developed country, this would mean still a very high inflation, but for Argentina standards, this is a huge success. If Milei maintains this trajectory, alongside the National Political Organization being led by his sister, Karina Milei, and sustains strong communication and agenda setting, as he's been doing for the last couple of months, this will boost his chances in October 2025 midterm elections. And the outcome of those elections are essential for Milei's broader vision of transforming Argentina in a more market-oriented, but at the same time, for the United States having one of its closest allies in the region. And the Argentina case is it could be used as a case study to see how Donald Trump is treating a country that has taken a 180-degree turn around and is being extremely in favor of your country. Is Trump going to favor Argentina and Milei given this orientation, or is gonna remain indifferent? Well, that would be a huge signal for the rest of the countries, um, aligning in the middle of these elections that we're talking about.
Which direction do you think that he'll go? I mean, Milei and Elon Musk were famously swinging chainsaws around together, and Elon's on the outs now. So does that mean that? And there's also, I don't know if you've noticed this from Argentina, but there's very much a division within Trump's base. It feels like over the Iran war. You have your Steve Bannons and Tucker Carlsons and your Elons out there lamenting U.S. fiscal profligacy, talking about how the neocons have hijacked Trump and they're starting this big war. And then you've got, the other stalwarts that are still there. And it's hard for me to sort of calibrate how much are in one camp and how much are in another, and how much political pressure is that going to put on President Trump. But do you think that President Trump will respond to Milei in that way, or do you think he'll just be? Because I mean, we talked about Israel and Iran. Israel was the country that said, "Fine, no tariffs whatsoever, and we'll do whatever you want." And President Trump didn't care about that. All he wanted to do was go to Saudi Arabia and sign AI semiconductor deals like 2 months ago. So, I'll put you on the spot. Like, which direction do you think it'll go?
A couple of thoughts. The first is some of the last presidents of the United States have stated during the campaign or at the first couple of months of their presidency that Latin America was the region that they were really interested in. And of course, then things happen. You have more urgent needs somewhere else, particularly Middle East for the last decades, but Europe as well, Asia as well. So Latin America, and going back to the first reflection that you were making, given that it's interregionally peaceful, is not usually an urgent matter for the U.S. For the first couple of months in this second Trump administration, there were signs that maybe this time Latin America was going to be more relevant. particularly given the role of China in Latin America's economy, given the role of migration for the president's campaign, and also given the security matter with drug trafficking and stuff. Now, what is happening in the Middle East will change all of that. Those priorities change, of course. I think that on the Latin American side, you will have to analyze each of the presidents. Talking about Argentina, Milei, even though a lot of people has claimed him to be extremely dogmatic, he has shown himself as really, really pragmatic. And in fact, you can see that now. For example, during his inauguration, President Zelensky was in Argentina, was there,
Mhm.
present, sitting in the first row. Uh, After the encounter between President Trump and Zelensky in Washington, Milei remained quiet. He didn't say anything. And it's the same thing he's doing right now. Of course, he was in Israel. He claimed or he announced the move of the embassy, and by itself that means a lot. But he remains quiet. In fact, even with domestic issues, he's remaining quiet. And I think that displays the most pragmatical side that he has. He knows when to talk, when to shout, but also he knows when to listen and when to wait. Um, Regarding the whole Elon Musk, Donald Trump side, I think the pragmatic side of Milei will also be displayed on that arena. Um, in the short term, he will have to be closer to Donald Trump, of course. Uh, but in the long term, we will see how the relationship between Elon Musk and Milei moves forward, particularly knowing that Argentina needs hard currency, needs foreign direct investments, and there were conversations starting of maybe in the best dreams of the current Argentine administration, having a Tesla factory here, knowing that we are part of the lithium triangle with
Mhm.
Bolivia and Chile. And we should analyze each of the countries how they will move with the United States. But from an American point of view, I think it will everything will move now to the Middle East. There are more urgent priorities happening right now. Um, Milei is still an ally, a very close ally, and it will be used, that relationship, as an example for different countries to move in that same direction. You have
Mhm.
extremely important elections happening this year, and we already had, for example, in Ecuador. In Ecuador, you had President Noboa, originally elected in 2023 through a snap election triggered by the cross death, the Muerte Cruzada mechanism that dissolved Congress under President Lasso, but he was re-elected this year with a full constitutional mandate, and now his term ends or extends until 2029. Um, Novoa is governing a country under siege from organized crime and economic fragility as well, even though the country is not actively renegotiated a major IMF program, it still remains highly vulnerable to market pressures. And Ecuador is clearly looking for support from the United States. So that's another country to take a look. Um,
Yeah.
and of course, talking about the consequences of oil prices and the relationship and what the relationship with Iran and the region, or the US and the region, we can talk about Venezuela.
Yeah, we could talk. I mean, I'm conscious of the time because I know you're just going to have to agree to come back on because we're not going to be able to cover all of it. But I guess the first question I have down that line of thinking, though, is because you're talking about the sort of from the region's perspective, the focus on the Middle East. that, at least on the surface, to me sounds like an incredible opportunity for China. Maybe not so much so for Russia because they're bogged down in Ukraine. But if China was looking for a vacuum of power to insert itself in, I mean, that seems like a prime place. You were mentioning, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was saying the things you said about how we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. We're going to focus on Latin America. Panama was, I believe, the first place that he visited. And now that is sort of all overturned. So do you think it creates an opportunity for China? I guess is the first part of the question. And then the second question is, and I know that this might be a way to back into some of the particular politics that you're talking about. Um, is there any sense that South America itself, and I mean Latin America more broadly, but I'm thinking this is more realistic in a South American context, where we will see more regional integration, where we will see sort of South American powers like cooperating and operating on the world stage that way? Or do we get another version of soft imperialism where no, like Brazil will have relations with China and the US will have good relations with Argentina, and Peru will be up for grabs? I'm like pulling things out of thin air to make a point there. Do you think there's any sense that no, like South America actually could be a source of great prosperity and wealth, and it could say, no, if you don't play along with us, we're not going to send you our soybeans, or we're not going to send you the lithium in the lithium triangle, and you need to invest here in order to build things, and we don't care whether it's the United States or China? So however you want to tackle that.
Regarding the first part of the question, I would think that it provides an opportunity for China. It is really important to clarify one thing that, and I was able to see this with my own eyes, and I was able to listen to this with my own ears through these past couple of years living in Washington and now spending the summer in Argentina. There's a very asymmetric way of thinking international relations from the United States and from South America. The United States is clearly concerned about the role of China, migration, and security, as I mentioned before. While the region is clearly concerned about some countries' inflation, some countries' their own security. Some countries need money, need investments, need infrastructure, need even really, really basic stuff. There's a famous saying that by some officials from Latin America in DC, that they say that when a U.S. official come to their office, they leave the meeting with a lecture on democracy, but when the Chinese official has a meeting with them, they leave that meeting with a new airport. So the Chinese have that leverage, even though you can see that trend is going down compared to what it used to be in the first at the first phase, let's say, of the Belt and Road Initiative. Is still a major actor. And what could happen to the United States, that it will redistribute their resources to the Middle East if they get involved directly or indirectly. We will have to see what happens with NATO and Russia. We will see what happens between India and Pakistan, and you mentioned between North and South Korea. But one of the most important things to understand this from an American perspective is that Latin America doesn't see China as the enemy. China has a huge advantage in Latin America compared to the United States, is that we don't have history together. With the United States, we have history, and the last century has been pretty tough, let's say.
To put it lightly.
Yeah. So you have, from a Latin American perspective, you have the country that was involved in some of the most outrageous events happening in the last century coming to you now and telling you, remember, we share values, while at the same time you have a country investing a lot, coming here, not asking for much in return, at least at first. And in a region that has an amount of needs for basic stuff, again, basic stuff, um, China has been using that leverage. Um, I think what it should be important right now, especially in the U.S. administration, is the role of officials that understand the relevance of the region, politically, ideologically, and economically. Um, Secretary Rubio is one of those. So the amount of pressure that they're going to be able to put in remembering that you have below you a whole region is gonna be really important. It's gonna be really, really important. And then the second part of the question was regarding regional integration. When I was telling you at the beginning of the conversation that Latin America is usually studied as one block, and we say U.S. Latin America relations, thinking that is a bilateral relation. You can easily fall into mistakes because today Argentina, for example, has Milei as the president, but 2 years before we had Alberto Fernandez as president. It was the extreme opposite of that. And what can prevent the opposite of Milei coming in 3 years? Nothing. What happens if after Petro in Colombia, you have a far right candidate? Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these, like these swings, it makes very difficult for the region to have a regional integration in the long term speaking. Of course, you can see some attempts of this with the Mercosur and the European Union, where the European Union, when talking about who can take advantage of the US taking all of the resources and attention to the Middle East today, the European Union can also use this vacuum, as you said, in the region. And the European Union Mercosur agreement could be an example of that. And it's really interesting to see the role of or the relationship between Lula and Milei in Mercosur today. Because you also have Uruguay. Uruguay today is much closer to Lula. Or Yamandu Orsi, the president, is really closer to Lula. And that all can shift really, really fast and very drastically. So it's really difficult to talk about regional integration. At least it's one of the things that I wish the most, but being realistic is one of the most difficult things today, and has been one of the most difficult things for the past couple of decades.
Yeah, I know, and I know that in asking it, it's like I'm having a Bolivarian fever dream, and everybody's wanted it. But it does seem like there's a geopolitical imperative maybe that wasn't there before, and it doesn't have to be political integration. Like, what is stopping South America or South American countries from saying, okay, let's put aside the ideology. Why can't we just have a NAFTA for just South America? Because if we could just trade with each other more freely and not just be a place where, China, I'm glad that China's investing in South America. That's great. But China basically wants commodities. Like, they're basically like treating it like an imperialistic relationship. So, okay, you get some money and we take out all of your commodities. And if you say nice things about Taiwan, we'll cut off the investment flows and we'll be mean to you and we'll do things like that. So it seems to me that, if the United States looks weaker maybe than it has towards the region in 50, 60 years. China is far away, so can't exert itself, but you want some leverage in negotiating with them. You've got, Europe and other parts of the world that are interested in the region for lots of different commodities. It feels like, to your point, no matter where you are ideologically on the spectrum, like Lula and Milei and Bukele and Sheinbaum, they should all agree that, hey, we should be trading more with each other. Like, if the United States is going to be protectionist and the EU is going to be protectionist, shouldn't we trade with ourselves and not just send our commodities cheaply to the rest of the world? Because in some sense, the structural problems that Latin America faces is precisely because the imperial powers invest a bunch of money when they need the resources, and then when they don't need the resources anymore, or when you get the inevitable boom and bust cycles in the commodities, they take their money away, and then you get these big cities that don't make any sense and countrysides that are completely underdeveloped. So I don't know. I get that it's completely unrealistic, but and it hasn't happened for hundreds of years despite people pushing for it. But there's never been more logic, I think, for at least some kind of minimal trade integration.
I agree with you. However, I must say that analysts usually, and we analysts usually, uh, fell into this mistake of thinking or wishing that this could happen, um, as if it were easy. Uh, However, we must remember that when we are proposing or analyzing or recommending these sort of agreements, coalitions, uh, we are thinking of it unilaterally. Is the coalition that I am proposing, that Facundo is proposing. But it's really difficult when you have different interests, domestic and foreign interests, clashing between two countries that are ideologically opposite. And also knowing that you have a country, country A and country B, let's assume that they're opposites ideologically. You have the population supporting that president at the time. Maybe no, maybe it's like Peru. But one of the things that I want to make clear out of this, and thinking like the big picture with all that is happening in the Middle East, um, I see this crisis as a reminder that Latin America is not isolated from global events.
Hmm.
I generally believe that this is a region that matters for energy, food, minerals, yeah, and even strategy. Um, Countries that can stay institutionally strong, keep their foreign policy clear, and protect their autonomy will, as you were talking about the imperialistic views, protecting their autonomy will have a better shot at navigating what comes next. Those that remain fragmented or overly dependent risk being caught in the crossfire of bigger players. And I think that in the next few months, we will see whether Latin America can step into this global moment with more agency, uh, or whether it gets pulled along with forces that it can't control.
I know we're running up on time, and I know we've probably only just scratched the surface here. So first of all, I hope that you'll come back on, but I want to give you the final word. So we've talked on very broad strokes about some very high level concepts, and hopefully we can drill down more in the future. But what's the one thing, or the one country, or the one insight that we haven't talked about that you want to leave the listeners with, and wanting for more, so that they'll come back and listen to us the next time we get a chance to chat?
I will go with a country that we haven't spoken about, uh, and that is Venezuela. I'm going to be very brief, uh, but Venezuela held presidential and legislative elections the past year. Both were fraud elections. Maduro claimed victory again. The process was widely condemned. Then, in early this year, 2025, they did something pretty provocative. In the legislative elections, they elected a governor for the disputed Essequibo region, which Venezuela claims but Guyana controls.
Mm-hmm.
And that move added fuel to a long standing territorial conflict. Uh, Because of all of this, before the elections, the US reimposed sanctions in April, including revoking Chevron's licenses. But now, with oil prices surging, Venezuela is still getting more revenue, or will get more revenue. It's a temporary relief for their economy. It also gives Maduro less incentive to reform. But at the same time, we will have to see what happens with the oil reserves globally, because the US is clearly seeing Guyana as an investment for them to get
Mm-hmm.
oil. So it's very interesting to see what will Maduro do with Guyana, knowing what is happening in the Middle East. Uh, Moreover, Venezuela's ties to Iran make it a key actor to watch, especially if the global conflict escalates.
That, and also, I mean, we've talked about this a lot. I mean, the way that Israel is taking it to Iran is also remarkable. And if you think about Iran as, the state that looks very powerful on paper and bares its teeth and says all sorts of threatening things, I mean, Venezuela in some ways has a lot of similarities with Iran. And if you're a decision maker in Brazil or even in Guyana, like, I wonder if you look at what Israel is doing to Iran and you say, would it be that hard to do that to Venezuela? I'm sure they don't have an air force. I'm sure they don't have air defenses. They certainly don't have a nuclear program. Like, if I was Maduro, I would be absolutely terrified by the precedent that is being set by what's happening in the Middle East. And maybe there's not an actor that can take advantage of it. But man, like, it just seems like bad news for I mean, I get that they get like a temporary bump when it comes to oil, but I would be very, very nervous about what happens next year in the context of what's happening in the Middle East.
If I have to take a guess, because I don't know Maduro, I can see him as one of those people that don't surrender. So if following your logic, the most worried actor should be the people of Venezuela and not Maduro himself.
Well, that is a grim note to end on, but I think we'll just have to put it there because we're out of time, and hopefully you'll come back on. Facundo, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll see you soon. Tell the listeners where they can find information about you or your analysis before I let you go.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Well, you can see some of my analysis at the website of the Wilson Center. I'm also an adjunct professor at the National Defense University here in Argentina, and also researcher at what is called the CEPE, that is the Policy Evidence Center at the University Torquato Di Tella. And we are all working on defense, energy matters, geopolitical analysis. So yeah.
Perfect. All right. Cheers.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob SHAP, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.